That's the one I use. So the presentation is entitled Assessing Generative AI's Impact on Student Research, Writing and Assessment, Production Activities in Higher Education, and Activity Theory Perspective. So just to introduce that, so what's the problem we've got at the moment? Well, generative AI was first introduced en masse in 2022 thanks to ChatGPT, has had the fastest adoption rate of any technology in higher education, which is quite a scary thought when you consider it's estimated that in 2024, around 88% of students are using generative AI to either research or write their assessment. And clearly the university's got the challenge between embracing technology, which obviously we would like to do, whilst maintaining integrity within the teaching and learning space. So a couple of questions that kind of have been posed by the literature include things like, what does it mean to be original? What is original work? We ask for original work. You know, my PhD asks me to develop original work. So what does that actually mean to us? And if Gen AI can write students' work, then how can we influence the learning? Isn't that really what we're worried about? There seems to be a preference in a lot of educational institutions to assess the product of the learning rather than the actual learning itself. And if ChatGPT and other AI tools can be used to effectively substitute the learning or cognitively offload, as one of my colleagues in Cradle in Australia would say, then are we actually assessing learning when we look at a dissertation or a final project, a master's degree, for example? Possibly not. So, as a result of which, I'd argue there's been a change in the student role following the advent of that. So, what I did is I undertook a desk-based analysis of the literature to actually understand, well, what is the impact of generative AI within higher education? Being an academic practitioner, I tend to go for the simple solution. Well, students are using AI and the university doesn't like it, but when you start digging into that, why don't we like it? Is it because, well, it's a technology that as a university we don't understand, or is it actually because, as I said, we think we're cheating learning out of that? So I decided to use activity theory, which I'll explain as the framework for my study, and then from the analysis of about 120 pieces of literature, I've used thematic analysis, which I'm sure many people will be familiar with, in order to develop 5 themes within the study. So just to talk you through a little bit about activity theory, we're now on 3rd generation activity theory, and if I have my way, in about 2 years' time, we'll be on version 4, because I have an idea about how this might be developed, but not for today. So turning to, if you like, traditional activity theory, 3rd generation is by this gentleman, Mr. Strong, who basically says that for every activity we undertake, there's a subject and an object. Well, that makes sense. I'm the subject to this. The objective is for me to give you the presentation, right? So, relevant like that. What tools have I got? Well, in this case, obviously, I've got a computer, I've got my laptop, my iPad that's got all my slides on, I've got a phone that I'm using to basically time the presentation to make sure I don't talk too much, and so on and so on. In the case of student research and learning, what tools have they got? Well, they've got pre-AI, online learning platforms, pedagogical strategies, and existing learning would be the typical tools that you would use, and then obviously research libraries, etc. What are the rules of the game? So understanding the rules of the game as a student are really, really important to me. It's no good telling me, well, it must be this, it must be this, it must be this. You need to explain to me personally, what does that actually mean in reality? What are you looking for? And that's been the subject of much, for me at least, of my PhD so far, is actually challenging my tutors about well, what are you looking for from this? Because I'm not sure that your assessment criteria is entirely clear so that I know what I'm being assessed against. So we've got the rules, we've got the community. Well, in this case, it's the group of academics that we're here today, or within the university environment, it would be those within the faculty. But it would also include other students and academics, and potentially admin staff. Within the university that I've worked in, we quite often use our admin staff to talk to students, for example, about plagiarism and academic misconduct policies, because the tutors are not kind of covering those areas, so we bring in the learning support team to explain it. Whether that's right or wrong is, again, a conversation for another day. And then we've got the division of labour between the student and the academic. Of course, when you start introducing AI to this, we suddenly see that now we've got Gen AI tools introduced, but now you've got the student with AI. So now I'm asking, is this just me that's writing, or am I co-author? And again, the object of the assignment historically would be production of the assignment, but now I'd argue that actually my role, if I'm using AI, is to simply collate and curate information. It's not about research anymore. It's simply about using tools that are available to me, if I use AI tools, to do that job. And the one thing that we know about AI tools is they work really well if you've got good knowledge of the subject. So you can use critical evaluation to identify whether or not the material that you're seeing is reasonable or not, and you've got the ability to test. But if you're a student cheating learning, of course that goes, so you no longer have that. In terms of the rules, we've introduced academic integrity fair use policy, eventually. In 2022, when it came out, a couple of the authors that are quoted within the research suggest that actually responses from university ranged from, well, we'll just completely ban AI, which, as somebody with autism, is a bit of a problem, because I use those tools day in, day out. I have them for a period of years. So actually you're disadvantaging me now by simply saying we'll ban AI. Gen AI, possibly, but AI, which is how the policies came out. Or alternatively, they say nothing. And that's a problem as well, because as a student, I don't know what I can and can't do, what's acceptable use. And other research that I've done around that area, talking to academics, indicates that all of the academics I spoke to have got a different view on what's acceptable and what isn't. So that's the problem. For our community, we then introduced Gen AI into that. One might argue that as a student, my objective is to become part of a community of practice, within that as a subject expert. Well, if I'm now using Gen AI, can I fake the knowledge in order to become part of that community? And of course, the division of labour, we start by seeing AI tools being introduced to that. So it's no longer just the student and the academic. We've now got the student and the AI tool, which is obviously a problem for us. So the question is then, well, what do we do? So, actually, we'll go back. So just before I go on to that, if I think about how is Gen AI used within research at the moment, I'd argue that Gen AI is a tool. Its purpose is to effectively mediate the subject's engagement with the research and writing process. So the role of the student, as I said, moves from a researcher and writer to that of the curator and editor. As a subject, we see a change in student agency. The researcher now becomes a co-creator and prompt engineer. So really the quality of their work is how good are they at prompt engineering. And obviously some people will be better than others, and we get into all sorts of arguments and discussions about fairness. If I'm a student from a wealthy family, for example, I can access some of the expensive versions of ChatGPT. So when it was first launched, there was a professional version that was charging $200 a month. Well, if you could afford that, great. If you couldn't, you had to go either with the free version. So we then start introducing inequality into that as well. So that's a problem for us. What about using AI? Does that actually change what we're assessing? Well, arguably yes, because as I said, my belief is that in a lot of cases, we're actually assessing the product of the learning rather than the actual learning itself, which is problematic because actually what industry values is actually that you can demonstrate that learning. So it's both technical learning, it's both subject learning, but it's also soft skills. And if what you are is an expert prompt engineer, that's going to be a problem when you come into industry. What about AI as a rules challenger? Well, it changes what the community constitutes as ethical production of an assignment. So arguably new rules are required to address the ethical implications of tool use. And that involves academics agreeing on what's acceptable and what isn't, and putting it in a policy that is actually understandable to students. We have a tendency when we write policies, both in academia and in industry, to tell you what you can't do rather than what you can do. And maybe that's something that we need to consider changing. As a redistributor of labour, as I said, you can use those tools now to cognitively offload. So there's a need there for really kind of the creation of new activities that come now within my activity system. So that's a challenge for us as well, about how do we deal with that as academics. You know, how do I deal with the students using AI to do a literature review? I don't have a problem with that if you're using it in an appropriate way. But I know other tutors that I've worked with have had, so that becomes problematic when you've got two people disagreeing on those kind of things because the policy isn't clear. And then, of course, you introduce new stakeholders when it becomes a community expander. So that has a role on, has an impact on the role of academics and support staff. And again, there's a change in agency that happens. So quite a lot going on. And I appreciate this is going at a fair pace, so I apologise for that. But within activity theory, so again, going back to my activity theory, the term contradiction is used to describe attentional mismatch between parts of the activity, and it can occur at 4 levels. So we talk about primary contradictions, so within a single activity. So the use of Gen AI as a tool, for example, can be both positive as a way of accelerating, you know, the way in which you can learn. It gives me instant access to a knowledgeable subject. You believe indeed that AI never hallucinates, of course, but generally you can get questions answered very quickly. My supervisor, when I did my MBA, said to me, I'm quite happy to meet with you, but I need 2 weeks written notice to answer any question, which was a bit of a problem because as a student I wanted to know now because I'm in the middle of writing my assignment. So actually coming back in 2 weeks, that throws quite a lot into things. So that's problematic as well for me. So as I say, at primary level, we get contradictions occurring. At secondary level, they will occur between the various components of the activity system. So, for example, between the subject and the rules. Take, for example, academic policies at the moment that deal with misconduct or breaches of integrity. So typically things like plagiarism. Well, if we define plagiarism as copying the work of somebody else without acknowledgement, and Gen AI generates original text, quote unquote, it's not plagiarism, right? So that's okay. Or not, probably not. If you acknowledged it and said AI wrote this, would that make it acceptable? I'm not sure that my supervisor would say that that was the case. Certainly, in fact, I'm pretty sure she'd have a problem with it. So that's obviously challenging to us. So if I skip, given the time, so if I skip on a little bit, I came up with, or the research came up with 10 contradictions, which through thematic analysis I reduced to these 5. So for the remaining couple of minutes, I want to just talk about these. So product to process. So what I'm saying is, again, this point about what are we assessing? And I've been really interested just that in the other session because they're talking about, well, what is good assessment? So I'm going to get the slides on that and see whether I agree with them. Because for me, you should be assessing the actual learning that's taking place, and ideally the final submission that you're getting should be a way of doing that. I'd argue that typically a student dissertation or final project where I've seen some formative version of a couple of chapters and then the final version doesn't really give me that confidence that actually the students learned. We've got the problem of isolation. Traditionally in academia, knowledge is created in almost as the lone genius in the attic. But actually, no, hang on, there's a problem with that because actually learning is active. So how can you possibly, genuinely argue that knowledge is individually created by somebody sat working on their own? I don't think you can. But I think at universities there's still a general belief that that's what we want to see. So I think there's a need to move from isolation to collaborative knowledge construction, whether you say that's with other people, other students, or whether you say that's with AI. I think hybrid writing is unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, here to stay. Talking about standardisation. As somebody with autism, as I said, having a particular format doesn't always work for me. I'd like to be able to control the way in which I learn. And quite often, a lot of the courses that we offer don't allow us to do that. And yet we talk about fairness to students. So I'd argue that we need to move towards personalisation of learning journeys for people. By doing so, you give me far more agency and therefore I'm far more engaged. So, absolutely, I think we should be doing that. The other real kind of sore point about that is authentic assessment. I heard a story, and I don't guarantee that it's true, but nonetheless, of a radiography student who, on placement, was allowed to use generative AI to assess scans. When she did her quote-unquote authentic assessment, looking at X-rays, she was told, no, you can't use Gen AI. So, is that really authentic? Yeah, I'd argue possibly not. So I think we need to look at that. There's a focus in academia on compliance. You must comply with this policy, you must do this, you must do that. And quite often they're negative. So as a student, any policy that tells me I can't do something, in fact, as an individual, any policy that tells me I can't do something, I'm looking at ways around. At work, we've been told you can only use Copilot. We've been given full Copilot licenses, but Copilot is probably the worst tool that we've got in terms of generative AI to do some of the stuff we're doing. So what happens? Somebody wrote a little program, little agent, to say, here's my question, now go to these AI products, retrieve the answer and return it in Copilot. And it does, quite effectively for us. So that's a bit of a challenge. So students will look for ways around rules that say you cannot. Whereas if you empower them by giving rules that they can, I'd argue that it's a lot more effective for them. So I think there's a lot in that to unpack, and hopefully over the next couple of years I will do that, and hopefully be able to publish papers to tell you how I've progressed. So thank you very much.
Do we have any questions from the audience, please?
Hi, Ian. Thank you so much. That was really interesting, and I love the way you kind of thought about this and carefully framed it. Like those themes there are really clear to me. I wondered whether you've seen or heard of any examples of assessment that integrates AI that kind of bring all these tips.
So I've seen there are examples over in Australia where they've done that with a tool, with a learning tool, and researchers I've spoken to them that have actually found it really effective. I think as a UK tutor, my immediate reaction is I don't like change and it's going to put a lot more work my way. And as an associate lecturer, I get paid a certain amount of money for a course. So I can't afford to take on additional workload, if you perceive it as that. But actually, as an individual, I'm very much in favour of those kind of things. I like the idea. I think there's a lot we can do with AI to encourage students that actually the tool use is fine, providing you use it in an appropriate way.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Once again, thank you, Ian. I would just like to ask, you mentioned appropriate use, and I'm wondering, for you, what would you deem appropriate use in your example that you mentioned for literature studies?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in terms of AI use, for me, using AI to retrieve information and summarise it would be perfectly acceptable. Tools that have been available to those of us with disabled student allowance have been available to do those kind of things for years. One might argue that if you ban Gen AI, it's a problem. I have probably more of a problem with things like Litmaps and Research Rabbit, because although they are quite good, there's a risk that you miss the papers because they've only got so many. And I think that's one of the challenges at the moment with obviously paywalls in place, is you run the risk, if you don't know who the key authors are to start with, you run the risk of missing stuff. And if you've got a tutor who's an expert in that subject, as I did with mine who loves authentic assessment, she will pick you up on it and consequently mark down and so on. So I think there's that aspect of stuff. If you're getting to a stage where you're using AI to write the paper and then you're rewriting it, that for me is problematic. And I think that's probably where I would draw the line. but I think most of the other uses for AI, if you accept that it should be done as part of the learning journey, and you've taught a certain amount of core knowledge within that subject, I think it's fine. But that's, as I say, just my personal view, not necessarily that of the universities.
I think that's what.
Lady at that end.
Hello, I'm also from University of Northampton, I would argue I teach events management, and so we have prioritised aligning with industry practice over necessarily the hardcore academic practice, and recognising that this is what our graduates need.
No, absolutely.
For the future career, so we can't shy away in our ivory towers and pretend that it's not happening, and that we're not then creating our graduates who are able to then deliver. I think you articulate this beautifully in terms of actually what the real application of this is. It's a tool. Let's make it better. Let's have our students to be able to keep ahead of that curve as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is it me? Yeah, Gloria from Coventry
Hi,
University
Gloria.
of London. Hi, thanks, Ian. I just wanted to ask, appropriate use, but how do you determine that when you have the final product in front of you? Because we can't police.
No.
So even if you advocate for it in the classroom, and they've had opportunity to engage with AI in a subject way,
Sure.
how do you can't police it?
No, absolutely. And I
So
think,
how do we do that?
yeah, I think that goes back to the young lady over there's kind of point about the learning environments that people have used. I think if you introduce a learning environment that measures continuously in very low stakes environments, you'll identify the students that are using AI appropriately and inappropriately. If we ask students to acknowledge their use of AI at the end of the paper, which a number of the universities are now doing, students panic because they think, well, am I allowed to do that? Should I admit to that? You know, what happens if I say, well, I used it to write my literature review and then I rewrote it? Or I used it to retract. You know, there's a paper that's just been published now about systematic reviews using AI. And the power of the tool to be able to do those kind of things very, very quickly. You know, it's estimated, I think, that a systematic review would typically take 18 to 12 months to produce. And we're now talking about being able to do that in less than a month using AI. So I think there's those kind of examples that you can take. But how would I assess it? It's an interesting one because I think there's a need for education of academics personally as to how do I detect and then being able to speak to. I don't necessarily agree with the approach of the, well, I suspect you're using AI, therefore I'm going to refer you to a misconduct panel. I think a conversation with the student to actually understand where they're coming from, what they've done, almost as a confidential conversation to say, look, you know, let's talk through what you actually did. You'll learn very quickly whether that student's used AI or whether they've got the learning. And actually, if what we're doing is using assessment to measure learning, do I care? I probably should. Well, as an academic, clearly I do. But the question is, should I? Because if that student can demonstrate the learning, then haven't they met the objectives that we set? So that's probably a step too far at the moment. But you know, that's where I would love to see things go in the future. Is to actually be able to say, can we consider? Did you learn what we told you needed to learn, and can you evidence it? As I say, that might be a step too far for a number of academics, unfortunately. Thank you for your question.
We can have one more question and have to move on.
Sorry.
Okay. We'll leave some opportunity later on.
Like the lady at the back of the room, Alexander from University of Northampton. Ian, one thing that it's an observation rather than a question to you. I think there are three C's, the three C's of kind of the institutional context to AI. And as you were presenting, I was taking some notes, and it's conventional, conservative, and controlling. And I think something that I'd like to make from this presentation that comes out to me is there is perhaps a difference in terms of how an academic academic practitioner perceives this content. And the use of AI as a tool in curating, etc., all of that was pointing out, and a conventional academic who's only an academic career. I think there is a dimension.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know whether you want to say.
No, I think that's absolutely true, Malik. I think we're in a situation where, you know, I've been to a number of conferences and I've listened to academics talk, and in some circumstances, I'd argue they've got no concept of the real world. And I think having worked or working currently within the real world, but also within academia and studying at the same time, that's just, in a sense, almost a USP that I bring to this. People don't like the way I challenge things, that's fine, I'm okay with that. I just go, hey, I'm autistic. I can do that, can't I? And my tutor backs off. It's great. But, you know, it's kind of, as somebody that was diagnosed just over a year ago, that's been an interesting exercise as to what you can and actually could do and should do with students, is to actually sort of understand where they're coming from and understand their learning needs. But yeah, I agree with you.
Thank you. So there will be time in the coffee break to ask more questions. So we just got to move on to our next presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi everyone. My name is Becky Upsher, so I'm a lecturer in psychology here at King's, and we're very... Sorry, I project more. We're very lucky to also be joined by Jay Ying today. Do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm a final year student in psychology at King's.
Yeah, so Jay was my project student this year, who submitted her dissertation last month, so can we get a round of applause? And has kindly agreed to stick with us and talk about her project today. For the interest of time, we'll skip the Mentimeter, but just to get a sense of the room, who is currently using AI in their teaching on any level? Okay, quite a few people. Any, no, I would never ever do this. No, okay, we're in the same space, all right. So just to outline a few projects that we've been doing in the department. My main area of research interest is supporting student wellbeing and learning, and thinking about that in the context of how we teach within the curriculum and assessment. And I've got a bit carried away with looking at AI and how that has interrupted things for students and how things are shaping up. So really interested in, you know, finding out what staff and how students and staff think about this, thinking about what students need from staff in terms of being able to use it sensibly, and thinking about how we can implement and integrate AI into teaching. Which brings us to the project that we'll talk about today. For me, it's really important that all of these projects have had student collaborators. I think, you know, when we're doing research that is about students, then students need to be involved, and many of these were student-led. The one that we're going to be talking about today is James' dissertation. So we did a pilot randomised control study of generative AI in teaching to support metacognitive learning in essay writing in undergraduate psychology students. And we're very aware that we probably should put this through ChatGPT to think of a more succinct title. It's a bit of a long one, but that kind of captures the essence of it. To give you a bit of background for this project, so if we think about teaching, you know, it does influence student wellbeing and learning. We need to start thinking about universal teaching strategies that help reduce things like anxiety. Assessment, as we know, can be a source of stress and anxiety for students, and we're thinking about essay writing, particularly in this project. We know that enhancing students' metacognitive awareness can reduce anxiety, but there's a bit of a theory and teaching gap in terms of regarding metacognition for university students. So this project really brings together a few different concepts. So we want to know, you know, how to use generative AI in teaching, because at the moment it's not very well understood. So this project, in a nutshell, is comparing traditional workshops, and we didn't really know how else to frame it, but you know, teaching with no generative AI is traditional, versus sessions that include generative AI in this space. I will hand over to Jing, who's going to run us through the methods.
So just in case, if some of you are not aware of what metacognition is, so imagine your thinking is like a train of thought. And metacognition is how you can reflect on your thinking and direct your thinking to achieve the goal of writing an essay. So for this project, we used a single-blinded randomized control trial design. So we randomly allocated King's first-year psychology students to the intervention or the control group. In both of the groups, students attended an essay writing workshop where we teach them about metacognition in relation to essay writing. The only difference between the group is that the intervention group, students were introduced to generative AI, so we gave them a list of generative AI prompts for them to interact with in the workshop. Whereas in the control group, no mention of AI was, we did not mention AI. Yeah, just use like traditional teachings of metacognition. Yeah. So the intervention was developed by lecturers and final year psychology students in, And so both of the intervention and the control workshop were held by the same facilitator, so that's Becky, and it was held in students' regular seminar classrooms, and the workshops were 2 hours long, held at the same time on Wednesday, 12 to 2 p.m., 1 week apart, with the control group going first and the intervention group the week after. And yeah, both of the workshop had the same structure and content, which will give you like a demonstration of the list of activities that were done. Attendance were manually recorded. We had a sample size of 53 students, 25 in the control and 28 in the intervention. And we also observed facilitators' consistency of performance and also students' engagement across the groups. And we also, for outcome variable, we measured its cognitive awareness and essay writing anxiety. And we also conducted a focus group to understand students' opinions of the workshops and how they think about using generative AI in university.
And we use the framework we use for reporting for these methods with some newly published checklists. So that's the reference at the bottom, which we'll put at the end as well, but the closer and cider checklist for reporting education intervention work. So we can describe metacognition in different ways. Jane kind of gave an example. For the purposes of this essay writing workshop, we focused in on 4 domains that really apply to essay writing. So reflection, planning, learning strategies, and monitoring. For the intervention group, we sort of made it clear that generative AI is a learning tool, not a shortcut, and it should be used to supplement, not replace students' own work and critical thinking skills. So this research was an extracurricular activity. First year psychology students did, in their core module, which all the students attend, did have a session on academic integrity and AI. So we didn't repeat too much of that content in this session, which freed us up to talk about other things, essentially. To give you a sense of the structure between the intervention and control group, so as Jamie pointed out, we wanted to keep things as consistent as possible between intervention and control, with the only difference being we were introducing generative AI and how that could interact with the activities in the intervention group. So we're going to whiz you through some examples of that so you can have a bit of an idea of what it looks like. If this was a slightly longer session, we would have a go at some things, but I'm not going to torture you by getting you to do activities in this session today, fortunately or unfortunately. But we started the session, both sessions, by getting students to list the stages of essay writing. We encourage them to think about this as detailed as possible from the moment they see the essay question, from needing a coffee, for motivation, all the different stages they can think of in great detail. And we did that so that we could go on to kind of thinking about this in terms of metacognition and how those stages map onto those. Of course, we gave them a good definition of metacognition. And then, so this was one example. So this was the planning domain of metacognition. We would give them a set definition. I thought it was important to kind of describe this in the context of essay writing, but also how developing this metacognitive awareness applies to kind of future careers and life outside of university as well. So it's not a kind of discrete task that only influences essay writing.
I will spare you from defining planning because I'm sure you're all amazing at this, this metacognitive skill. So we had the great big list of stages of essay writing. We would then go through each domain one by one and firstly get them to link whatever in the list linked to that stage of metacognition. So for example, refer back to the list which items are associated with planning. For the intervention group only, this was then where we would introduce AI for the first time in the session, and we would give them an example or demonstration prompt that aligned with that metacognition domain. So this is one example within the planning. So they had a chance to kind of think about the list that they had, develop some SMART goals, and see what the prompt generated for them. I wrote the initial prompts because it was only 1 2-hour session, but I gave students the flexibility to, change the prompt if they wanted to. Some of them had never opened ChatGPT or Copilot before. There were other students who were a bit more advanced, so there's a bit of flexibility with the activity and how they wanted to engage with it. And we did give them some discussion and reflection time after each activity, which for me was really important because the moment we introduced AI, they were all on their laptops or phones, kind of not talking to each other. So it was important to have that kind of discussion, reflection. Some were really frustrated, weren't they, at the outputs and kind of what it led to. So that gave other students the opportunity to say, well, did you try this? Did you follow up with this prompt? They were really learning from each other. For first year psychology students, I was really impressed with how they were able to critically engage with this, how they were able to figure out where AI was really useful versus when they didn't need it at all and actually they benefited more from not using it. So it was really interesting discussions in the room. We would then, we had to give a demonstration for the AI group because we couldn't assume that they'd used AI before, and then we would get into an activity that they could try. And I'll show you a similar activity that we did in the control group that didn't use the AI prompt. So this was one in the intervention group where they had their list of essay writing, and then they could come up with questions so that it was kind of a Socratic dialogue with Copilot before then kind of getting it to generate a sort of Gantt chart and planning out their time in order to write the essay. This is quite a long prompt, sorry, it's quite difficult to read, but they could copy and paste things in the workshop and amend it as they pleased. A similar activity in the control group was essentially just doing this manually, looking at the list, allocating time against it, creating their own timeline, and allocating the number of days, hours they would. So similar task, just the process was different. We would then finish each domain by giving them additional tips because it was only a 2-hour session. So we would give them other ideas of what fell under that metacognitive domain, and in the AI group some sort of additional prompts that they could go away and try. But for all of them, the slides were pretty much the same in terms of the examples that we gave them. And we always mark that as a try later thing. Am I missing anything, Jane? Jane's very good at picking me up on things that I've missed and very detail orientated, so we're a good team. So we'd essentially repeat that for the 4 different metacognitive domains, and that made up the workshop. So very structured session in terms of what we covered. So we'll give you a flavour of the results.
So for the results, in terms of metacognitive awareness, there was no significant difference between the baseline between the intervention and the control group. Both groups experienced an increase in metacognition after the workshop. However, there was no significant difference between the groups. In terms of essay writing anxiety, there were no significant main effects for both time and group. In terms of the focus group, so students from the intervention group were in the focus group. They found that the intervention was supportive in terms of supporting how they can use AI for like for the essay writing, and they found it interesting in general. And they also found it to be motivating to helping them to start writing an essay. And so students were also surprised that the university was openly talking about AI. They thought that AI was like a taboo thing to be talked about. And students were keen to learn more about how they can use AI responsibly in line with the university's guidance. And most students felt that the workshop was too long. It can be like cut down into 2 sessions of like 1 hour instead of one full 2-hour session. Yeah.
So our kind of way that we interpret this and think about the implications. Thank you. So what we took away from this, so no kind of big, huge differences between the 2 different groups. For me, that wasn't that important. For me, that just meant that putting AI as teaching didn't hinder them in any way, which I think is an important observation. And it was the pre and post survey. The post survey was sort of delivered immediately after the workshop, so it's no real surprise that we didn't have any observed effects in terms of essay writing anxiety. They didn't have the time to kind of implement this. So keen to kind of in the future do more longitudinal research to kind of think about how talking about metacognition and using Gen AI in teaching kind of impacts student outcomes. And I think we need more extensive qualitative work as well to kind of indicate how students feel about this. We only invited the intervention group to the post focus group, so it was sort of a bit limited there on getting their views, in-depth views about this. And what we did find, and this was for the control group and the intervention group, the students did value that opportunity. I think in line with what Ian was saying about thinking about the process over the products and the outcome, we're just slowing things right down on picking essay writing as something, of several components to think about and strategies for learning rather than, just that end product. Anything that you want to add? This is just a session if you're interested. So myself and some colleagues delivered a session around metacognition, AI and dissertation projects. So if you're interested in accessing the workbook that we went through in that session, feel free to scan the code. We were really talking about, this was a staff-facing session, thinking about how we use AI tools to understand the learner, but then the other way around as well, how learners can use AI to deepen their understanding. Just giving people a chance to didn't get it, let me know, we can get it later. So our sort of final reflections then, what should we think about when teaching generative AI? We need to be thinking about improving AI literacy. Students are at very different levels in terms of this. Some are very proficient, way better than all of us in the room, versus students, who haven't even opened AI. So prompt engineering does need to be covered in the curriculum if we're thinking about this. Critical evaluation skills are so important, allowing that time for discussion and unpicking things. How we prompt, what we get from the output, etc. Bringing ethics and talking about, environmental impact, data privacy, these kind of things, super important as well. Data privacy, I think, is, from what I've observed, anecdotally, is the last thing students think about. And if we're thinking about research, in our teaching, telling students things like don't put participant data into ChatGPT, these sort of things. And most importantly, thinking about how we can support learners to use AI in a supportive manner that doesn't compromise their learning. Jamie and I were having a conversation about this, and Jamie called it the light bulb moment, which I really like, supporting this sort of learning and this passion for the subject matter. And making sure that isn't lost in this world with AI. So I thank Jamie for giving me a nice kind of representation of that. Some references if you're interested. Some of our work in the department. The last two are sort of college-wide. So if you're at King's, we now have a SharePoint which brings together all the resources, which is really good because there's a lot happening across the university, and it's in one place now, which is good to see. The bottom one, anyone can access the Future Learn course, so colleagues across King's developed this, and it's just really helps break things down in terms of bringing AI into education, so I'd recommend that. I think many universities get this for free if you use your institutional email, so give that a try if you're interested. And that's us. Thank you.
Questions, we've got 10 minutes for questions. Anybody like to start, please? Sorry. I think you start and then I'll move on to you. That's all right.
Thank you, Lane's presentation was really interesting. Hopefully you get a good outcome on presentations. I'm interested in why you made the choice to follow up as quickly as you suggested you did, recognising that maybe in hindsight that may have affected the results.
I think it was logistics mainly. You know, this was designed as an undergraduate research project, limited timing, so that definitely came into it. And yeah, students are notoriously bad at following up over a long period of time, but need to think carefully about this, and I think it is important to try and think about longitudinal.
Really interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Yes, mine's just a quick question as to, I mean, essentially what you're saying is that the learning outcome really wasn't significantly different. Surely you would have thought that it would have been better with Gen AI because they would have been able to do more research in a shorter space of time, got a better platform to then build from.
I actually didn't. I didn't go into this thinking that the Gen AI condition would be, you know, produce much better outcomes, to be honest. If I'm doing my job well in terms of talking about metacognition and thinking about, you know, how we get students to think about themselves as learners, then there shouldn't be different outcomes. And that's why we were keen to have that observer element. So we had a PhD student and Jay, they both sat in on both sessions. To be critical of me essentially and make sure that I wasn't getting overexcited in the AI condition and teaching, you know, differently in the control condition. So maybe it's the way I approached it, I don't know, but no, I didn't expect there to be huge differences. And for me, I guess it was kind of just thinking, is AI hindering things? And actually, there was almost elements of that when I saw students shut off and being in their own world doing AI tasks. So I'm glad we thought of, you know, incorporating the reflection discussion elements, which we had in the control group as well. But I think it was especially important in the AI condition, so students don't get locked into their own world and don't talk to other students. Yeah.
And did you mention? Was your question about like doing like literature search with AI?
Well, I think my assumption would have been, you know, that you get a better output because, of course, you can do so much more with AI. So it's like sort of scaffolding, really, that you can get such a good analysis within minutes with AI, and then you can build on that, you can critically analyse that, therefore your whole understanding might be to a different level. I mean, if I understood you right, you're really saying that actually Gen AI didn't really improve the educational.
It's the way I think. Has it improved our lives? Are we more productive? Are we suddenly producing way more output? I mean, maybe some people are and I'm doing it wrong, but do you see what I mean? It's just reshaped the way we've done things, I guess.
And I think like when you're using AI, like for me, I don't want to like write about something that I don't understand. So it's actually like monitoring what do I understand. I'm not just trying to get the best outcome. I'm here like, okay, I wrote this, do I understand this? And what's the next step? It's about building it up. Yeah.
There's a big, I think it's a great study in experimental work, even though that's not my background.
But there's a big leap from a 2-hour session with some very clear learning outcomes that's assessed in a way that's very robust to AI interventions, with a group of self-selecting students out of term time. I got it
It was in term time.
Still self-selecting.
Yeah.
And the standard 12 or 15-week module with one piece of assessment at the end, and a whole group of students who haven't necessarily self-selected to
Yes.
be there. How can we take the lessons on the method and so on and do some natural experiments in our own modules that could feed a bigger multidisciplinary.
Are you based at King's? Are you?
Queen Mary's, near.
Well, maybe some people can have some perspective here. We recorded King's Ethics. We're not allowed to recruit our own students. I think it's fantastic to have education projects that are student-led, and this was a student-led project dealing with people to students. I kept out of that. So I actually don't know how research works in embedded modules where we teach the students. It's very challenging to get around that in terms of our ethics. So this was our way of kind of thinking about how do we navigate this, how do we test something out in a small way, with the intention of trying to figure it out later on in terms of, like you say, doing something on scale, you know, with students across, you know, a semester.
We have the stupidity where if you're doing the experiment in order to do your teaching better, you don't do the ethics at all. If you're doing the experiment,
Which university
if you're doing the experiment in order to publish a paper,
Yeah.
you should.
Okay. Yeah.
One is gathering data for policy development.
Yeah, versus a sort of evaluation. Yeah. So if anyone knows the answer to that, I'd be interested.
I'm Zsófia from University of Durham. I've said that all was conducted at workshop by the prompts anyway, but how much was their input apart from this prompt, or what they were getting out of that prompt? How do you assess that they were successful or the learning took place?
Yeah.
So the danger is just about macro-analyzation of education.
Yeah.
Because now we're just going prompting, getting the answer. What is the essence of learning before that? Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's really important to think about. I think because we had limited time, and I didn't want to assume students were advanced in AI prompting. That was my kind of rationale for creating prompts and showing them the way and giving them the flexibility. We didn't sort of record their outputs or, you know, what follow-up prompts they were using. That wasn't kind of the scope of this study. But I think that would be interesting, you know, and I think that's where, like you were saying, interventions over time, where we could have the opportunity to prompt engineer, teach prompt engineering a bit, and kind of influencing that process of what they put in and what they get out, and you know, how they're evaluating the outputs and that sort of thing are really important. So I completely agree. This was a tiny intervention, and we need to understand more about how students are using AI and, you know, what they're putting into it and what they're getting from the output and how they're interacting with that output as well.
We just have one more question. Thank you. Go ahead.
Sure. Thanks very much. Really interesting. I'm a master's student in Birkbeck, right in the middle of my research project about AI and students' use in a business school setting that are also working at the same time. So they've got that. There's two different contexts essentially, two different norms. My questioning to them is about how it's discussed, trying to establish the social norms in their academic studies, and there's very little conversation between students about their use of AI. But there's even less, almost zero, between students and academics. Yet we know that academics are using it to facilitate their literature reviews. Maybe some are using it in their journal submissions, or rather the editing process and the publication process. So it was really interesting to see one of your observations, which was, encouraging that sort of student academic conversation. I'm saying it is noticed by students that academics don't talk to them about AI use.
Yeah, I think the fact
that's
is,
really interesting.
That some students thought I was a bit controversial. Having a whole session on it speaks volumes, and that we can have a follow-up chat if you like. But another study that I ran last year was about found that here, and students really wanted staff to open up that dialogue. And conversations I've had with staff, staff are scared about talking about it because they don't know things. And my kind of response to that is no one knows things because it's so new. And actually just giving students the opportunity to talk about it is, step one, and opens the door for other things. But yeah, we can follow up. Thank you.
Which one should we go? Right, yeah. Do you want the clicker? Oh, yeah. Control. I think I'll go that way. Yeah.
Okay, welcome. I'm Simpson. I'm one of these academics who actually does encourage my students to use AI. And I'm an HR manager for the project in academic. And I tell my students that one of the things I would ask them on recruitment is how they use AI and the jobs in which they're applying for. But they always go ahead of them, but I'm not really. But I do really encourage you. So through this kind of experimenting, which I hope you'll sort of, if you don't use it, you'll kind of start to experiment. We are learning, and we're learning so much, and we're learning about AI, and it's really exciting. And I will tell you RJ in a second. So this is what we're going to cover in this presentation. We're going to look at the sort of introductions to ourselves, the aim of the project we're doing. We're actually going to fund this project by King's in innovative education. So we're trying to do something a little bit different, and then we'll tell you how we're doing it. So we're trying to do some digital media artifacts, and we're partway through the process at the moment. A bit further on in the process, we'll be telling you about, we would probably show you the media artifact we're developing, because we had the excitement of actually seeing it halfway through the development yesterday. We'll go through our design process, how we're using AI, and then we'll tell you sort of about our insights about our challenges and our investing. So about ourselves. So I'm Penny Simpson, and about 3 years ago I got involved in King's online program. I became the program director of the new online program at King's, which is the MSc in Global HR. I've been an HR manager in business, then I became an academic, and I've been a program director of HR programs, but this is the very first time I'm involved in an online program. So it's very exciting and very scary at the same time. We launched the program last September, so I have 25 students on the program. But it's fantastic, and I'm actually working a lot with Romas in the audience there, who's also a program director of the MSc Marketing Online. We do a lot together, where about every 2 weeks we have a chat about the excitement of working online students, what our challenges are, and trying to work through our challenges. And then we have Sarah.
So hello. That sounds a little almost like too much of a manage expectations. So my role at King's is I'm a learning designer, and my job is to work with academic colleagues like Penny to help them translate their academic content into an online digital course. So I'm a bit disturbed to say you found it scary, actually.
Yeah, I did find it scary at the start, but I was working with Sarah. So Sarah works online all the time. So she translates academic work into how it should look online, some of the exciting things to do, how it should look. And so it would be a challenge for Sarah because some academics can be quite dry and have very clear ideas about them. Well, some of us are open, and I'm one of these people who's quite open to ideas, and so we have some really interesting chats about the stuff. But my job is really to make sure the students get learning. We talked about learning, make sure the students get learning. So Sarah and I have some fantastic chats. So that's how we became working together on the programme. So this is the aim of what we are doing and how we're using AI. But the background to the story is that with the programme launched, and there's lots of stuff that's asynchronous online. But the students also have to do some reflective practice. Typically in the past, I do some reflective practice, we talk about reflective practice, very interactive. And I wasn't sure, and I wasn't convinced that the practice and the skill of reflective practice was coming out with students just reading stuff and maybe watching YouTube videos. So in the webinars that we had, I thought it'd be good to kind of do a session that I was talking about reflective practice. I'm passionate about reflective practice, I do it all the time. To bring out what reflective practice was. So, I talked to Sarah one day, just started last year. I did the London Marathon last year, very exciting, my very first time. And subsequently run 3 marathons, but I don't want to run some long distance. You get people holding up cardboard things with messages on. You get messages saying, you'll see your toenails in heaven, and stuff like that. You'll also get a message that's saying, press here for a power up. Yeah, so press the button, like on a button, two buttons, press here, so skills input or energy input if you're running. And I was saying to Sarah, wouldn't it be good if we could have a skills input just about particular skills that we need to kind of get into the programme?
Yes, so I was very excited that an academic had come to me and asked for my help. It's completely unheard of, and it will go down in history, I'm sure. Apologies to an academic colleague. So I got very excited because I've been looking at the concept of using storytelling instead of traditional, like, talk presentations to camera, talking heads, which are kind of like the main bread and butter of the media that we tend to produce in our online programmes, mainly because they're easy to produce. Media team might not like me saying that, but generally speaking. So when Penny was talking about wanting something really energising and like a quick burst, I was like, how about storytelling? Let's try and see if we can create kind of a short media piece, a story around reflective practice that is going to move away from kind of like the dry, this is kind of a theory of reflection and this is how you move through it. So you've got excited then?
I got excited, I got really excited, and both thought, wow, this makes sense. This will be completely different to anything I've done while teaching. Because a lot of my teaching my students on the stage is just too much on the slides, we've forgotten about it. But they really enjoy the tutorials, which are much more interactive. So we put together a bit, and we've got some funding, and we put a head together for the programme. What kind of things we really need students to know? So online students, we really need to know how to be effective as an online student. Then I have questions about reflective practice. And then we're also doing lots of team working online. We've all done team working online, during COVID, more organisations are really working out how to do effective teamwork online. But those are 3 subjects that we went through, and so this is our project. Our project is trying to do media pieces using storytelling, and we're now telling how we use AI in that storytelling, and we're funded, and we're still very excited. We're super excited. Yeah, but we're probably working on this in January, and we're still really excited about it. So, why storytelling? So why storytelling? Well, storytelling, as Sarah said, in the digital media, there's lots and lots of sort of things about storytelling. And storytelling is about that sort of passion, it's about that motivation, it's about linking into personal story. So it's about trying to get that engagement through motivation. So really, to be engaged with things and then be motivated by things. So one thing, so when you go out here, you might remember me losing my toenails in the London Marathon with a sign, you know, a sign of power up. But it's that kind of story, me telling you a story, is probably more likely to remember it. So this is some sort of some of the academic, you know, background behind storytelling. And then digital storytelling is adding that digital media. So we are really hoping that these digital media pieces that we're producing can be launched in a widespread format, lots and lots of courses. So adding to digital media. So what we're doing, we're trying to do it, as we'll explain a little bit later, trying to do it at fairly low cost to make it replicable so we can do more stories using this digital media technique, using AI. So we are using sort of visual piece and a narration. We have a narration going.
Yeah, so just a bit of context. If we're working on a typical module, it's normally a bit of a linear process, quite limited collaboration and limited input for more creativity and innovation. And I think sometimes kind of more creative and team feel a little bit constrained by the approach we take to media. Might be a bit of an understatement. But Penny and I, this wasn't part of the module development process, so we had free rein to do whatever we chose to do, and we wanted to move to a more kind of co-creative piece. So instead of the academic colleague being the one that writes the script, and then the script comes to me and the media team, we wanted to work on the script together. We felt there was, well, to be honest with you, it felt a bit daunting and too much for one person to be that creative to write a script that was going to make a reflective practice into a really exciting, engaging story. We felt that one person on their own was not going to be able to achieve that because none of us are trained script writers, to be perfectly honest with you.
But to be fair, we have spoken to other universities that do these media pieces using digital media pieces using storytelling, and they have in the past employed storytellers, script writers to write a story, and then they're employing people who are incredibly sort of enthusiastic and to be able to do that narration of the story. But some of the problems is getting the script writers and also paying for the script writers. So this is where we started using ChatGPT.
We were so conscious that we wanted this to be more than independent. We wanted to use expert voices from around things, and also from students, student support advisors, academics, subject matter experts to help us kind of identify what the nature of the content should be. So what do these stories need to include? So we had online conversations in teams. We took transcription teams, anonymised them, and embedded the transcription teams along with academic slides or reflective practice team working and other transcripts from more traditional media pieces in ChatGPT. Gave it this set of themes that we wanted it to summarise the material around, learnings around, so that we then had like a crib sheet to go into the design workshop, which was going to be the next phase. Penny and I have come up with those key things which we felt were going to help us with our storytelling approach, and we also double-checked what came out of ChatGPT just to make sure it did correlate with what we thought were the key things that were coming out that were important, and that hadn't randomly come up with something a bit weird, and it didn't, and it was all good. And so then we went into the design workshop phase, where we also made extensive use of ChatGPT.
Yeah, so the design workshop, this is probably really common sense, but we all got together online and we used we used AI to just help us work together. And it was the most incredible, I would say, absolutely mind-blowing for me, having this as the kind of core of our workshop. That's all working together. So we had students ourselves, we had experts, we had media designers,
visual designers,
and we're all in the same workshop. So I think our workshop was 2 hours, 1.5 hours, 2 hours. But it was just the most powerful thing And what we did is Sarah and I said, okay, these are the little data that we come up with, we'll put it into ChatGPT and we'll read some of the prompts that we've used. Then we together looked at the outcomes, decided how to tailor it, change the prompt. Both presentations so far talk about prompt engineering. Absolutely incredible. Just use AI and try out.
Sorry, Penny, it's probably just worth saying that the main prompt was that we asked it to write the script.
Yeah.
That might have got a little bit lost.
Yeah.
Too excited. We actually asked it to write the script. Yeah.
So we asked it to write the script and we tailored the script and we asked it to put in a slightly different thing. Then, one of the people there asked obviously to talk about this, it came up with characters. And our intention is to do more and more of these media pieces. So one of the people in the room said, well, wouldn't it be interesting we could put that in a different context so that we can use that person? So we then said, AI, could you come up with the backstories for all the characters that you used in this story? And it did. So we are now using, and we developed scripts, and then we came, okay, that student experience advisor that you just mentioned, who's come from, who comes from Dubai, who work with these students. Now, could you tell the story from their perspective, and now could you put it in a story about team working? And all the time we were just refining it, and this workshop was just wow. And then as an academic, I'm still all the time making sure that the educational learning that needs to go in continues to be in, and the stories bring out that learning that students have to go through, and the media designers to make sure the story had loops and emotion and conflict and drama and all these other things, and then Sarah's looking at all the bits that seem.
My favourite prompt was more drama, please.
Yes, we put it.
Well, more conflict.
Yes, Sarah put in a prompt saying, please could you add more conflict to this scenario? So it was very much an iterative process when we worked together, and it was collaborative team working at its very best. Probably one of the most powerful team working scenarios I've been in. So this is sort of an example of some of the things we did. So it just started off with, please create a fictional story, you reflect practice, then change the context to be in an HR situation, add some academic definitions. Then it was quite bullety, so then we said, more prose, less bullets. Then there's Sarah's, please add more drama to the story, such as a conflict. That was definitely Sarah's. So we tried all these prompts. So the power was contextual discussions happening online in real time, backstories for the characters, and us agreeing immediately the media approaches. So the media people were immediately thinking, how could this work? Does this work? Will this work?
So yeah, we can kind of fast-track this, but basically what we found was that using AI in this way really helped the innovative creativity of the team, particularly in a way that was safe. Because if an academic's written a script and the creative team go, it's quite uncomfortable to make those recommendations. But because no one person wrote the script, it was a very safe and free-flowing environment. So some of the key pieces of learning, I think, that came from this is that it did speed up the process, so that it made it very easy and very quick for us to do. I think we did have to be clear with what we were saying, the elements of what makes a good story, like we did want more conflict and more tension because we wanted it to be emotionally engaging for the students. In terms of ethics, bias and accuracy, the characters are very gender stereotyped, so we had to go back and rewrite quite a few of their key attributes just to make sure that it wasn't too gender biased.
In terms of collaboration, I think that's probably come out in what we've talked about. For me, is for Sarah, it's just an incredible experience where it was real effective team working. Constantly make sure that I had my sort of head focused on what the students have to know, that sort of end goal, what do they have to know, what are my learning objectives, what are the students' learning objectives, and all the time making sure we were trying to do this at low cost. So even the media pieces, we were looking at them yesterday, that we are trying to make sure they're sustainable, they're low cost, that we can replicate them, so we're trying to do blueprints so we can do more and more of them. The last one, that was the last one. So practical takeaways, think about making AI part of the team and not being scared of it.
In this case, it was a real-time, exciting, responsive script writer. But as Sarah said, that because it was generated by us all, it wasn't, we weren't precious about what's being written. We were experimenting. A lot of time we have so much more understanding about AI now than when we started the project, and serendipitous outcomes. Had that workshop and someone said, would it be interesting to know the backstories, we wouldn't have this. We have this suite now of characters that are in our stories. I think allow AI to be creative and for example, keep an open mind. I mean, AI, as we're going through this, suddenly comes up with, would you like to make this into a guidance note for students? And we go, yeah, we would. So we did one. Someone wanted something, a guidance note on team working, effective team working online. So we managed to do that in 5 minutes, I think it was. It took us with AI's help, based on the data we'd originally collated. Keeping an open mind, and with the AI, we are able now to have this consistency of stories because we've got these backstories. But as an academic, I was certainly using this to recreate all my tediously boring presentations and PowerPoints that I had been using for the past few years, and really being open to change.
Thank you, Penny and Sarah.
Thank you.
On time. Yeah.
My name's Dan, I'm from University of Upsher. I was just wondering what happens to the scripts at the end? You then turn that into, how was the script used after that?
Yeah, so we're excited to do in production at the moment. So yeah, at the end of, so we actually had 2 workshops. At the end of one of the workshops, we actually had the final script. At the end of the other workshop, we had a bit more work to do on it. We still then used SharePoint, all just go in and kind of gave ourselves some space to reflect on it, go back in and check a few things and tweak it and make sure that there was enough kind of moving back to keep enough of the storytelling elements in it so that it hadn't got lost. But yeah, so at the moment it's in production literally, so we've been in the studio, we've had it narrated, we've got the voiceover, we had a meeting yesterday in the media team. I know that's a luxury, sorry. But the media team are now doing the visuals for us. I'm hoping we can make sure that it's shared somehow. We're hoping to have the kind of proof of concept finished by end of July maybe, and then final product to go live in September.
Great.
But the trying to do it at no cost, we knew that we wanted the story narrated. So my program officer is an actor because I'm a dramatic, but he's actually narrated the 2 stories. So it was difficult when ChatGPT wrote it from the perspective of a female from the time. Yeah. So they're narrating it. They came into the studio and did a narration, and now they're putting in the visual. But we're trying to do it really low cost, and we're trying to make sure that it's sustainable and we can do others. But yeah, hopefully in the next conference we can actually play all of the 3 of them.
Did you consider using generative AI video to do this for you, or was it just because you've got a media team, you just went more
Yeah, I think my colleagues more hated me in the media team. So we have a full-on media production team at Kingston. We've got graphics team, we've got media editors, producers, etc. No, we actually didn't consider using AI, probably for that reason, but we did play around to see if it could do some of the images, say the graphics team, because they were doing this outside of their day job. Actually, we were conscious we were asking them for their time. So we thought maybe we can help them by asking AI to generate the images. Absolutely rubbish. So yeah, it doesn't compare to what the professionals can do. But what's quite interesting is that there's 2 members of the team come up with that are fairly similar scripts and have come up with completely different. We've got 2 different, I'm sorry, that's too small. We've got 2 different visual designers working for us. task. I mean, they're not creating the images themselves, they're using like kind of Shutterstock and things like that to create it easily. But it is what we're loving is we're going to have to very different materials to final pieces as well. Which is really like we will get used to that.
You have the lady there and the bottom. Hi, Sharon Morgan and Penny, their neighbour. Fellow runner. So, I can vouch for it. So I saw Penny running up and down the seafront. So, a question for you both. Yeah. Thank you for that presentation. I suppose the question that I'm going to pose to you and also other colleagues who presented in the room, you talk about collaborative storytelling. What about collaborative marking? GenAI. And all of the ideas. And the only reason I made it was it came up with teachers in schools a couple of weeks ago, talking about the efficacy of it. And so if we are moving this way, why are we not maybe adapting GenAI to support, especially when academic workload is coming up, mental health and wellbeing issues, we've got reduction in staff, resources. So is this not something that maybe we need to be considering as well? I think probably yes. That would be my answer.
Absolutely no idea. Where's the learning side?
Yeah.
Just say my name on this one.
I think, Michelle, that's a fantastic point.
Can you give us your perspective and say a bit more about your role and your perspective?
Yeah, I'm Dean of Students at the University of East London, and I'm very acutely aware with time pressing on our students, especially we have a lot of commuter students. I think that, turning around and saying, no, you can't use Gen AI is not the way to go. We need to change our assessment. Say to them, like, we want you, as said, we want you to create this piece of work using generative AI, but then critique it, knowing what you've been taught. So I think the challenge that we've got is it has so rapidly developed that we've just come out of COVID, cost of living, we haven't even drawn breath as a sector, and we're having to literally, going in terms of having to address this so quickly. I just think actually there needs to be a bit of kindness about how we move forward, not only with our students, but also staff. And actually the efficacy of students coming in, understanding when you can use Gen AI, when you cannot use Gen AI. And I think actually that kind of guidance and advice is critical to embed into the curriculum and into how we educate our students.
One of our colleagues, Carmen at KDS, is certainly working on, and they presented the conference recently, working on absolutely where students are asked to use an essay prompt to get a Gen AI answer to then to critique the answer. So we're really embracing it and really give students really clear advice.
Sorry, just have one more question that we can get and then we'll move on.
Hi, I'm Zsófia. I'm coming from the University of Upsher. And it's a really great presentation. Thank you for that. And I want to ask about, because you mentioned there's a kind of a group of people collaboratively developed together with AI, including students. So I want to ask, what's the role of students in this section, and then their perspective on the involvement or the kind of sharing in the whole thing?
Oh my God! So our student was amazing.
We had some students, but
so we spoke to some before the workshop, and then we had one come and join us for the workshop. Now, the lady that came and joined us for the workshop is actually a primary school teacher at Korea, isn't she? Yeah. So she's super into learning and teaching as well, so I suppose that kind of helped and enthusiasm. But we were able to have her in the room and contributions. So ChatGPT come up with a story in this scenario. Is that relatable to you? So it was like from your perspective and talking to your colleagues and your fellow students, these things to experience, because actually there was the character Carlos who's doing his startup in Mexico City, and some of the challenges that were impacting his abilities to study online were kind of so high level challenges. She was like, we don't experience actually problems. So we need to make sure that it's something. And I'm also going to say, what would be more relatable for you? What would it be like if you used an animated character versus kind of like somebody that felt more real using photographic imagery rather than So there was a contribution to their strategic like of what AI had produced and whether it was relatable and realistic or whether it just sounded a bit stupid or a bit patronising. But also in terms of look and feel of the actual media piece when it's finished, what would you respond more to emotionally in terms of look and style? So it was amazingly helpful to have that input because we don't know, we're not the students. But also originally, when we sort of did in focus groups, we had the students involved in all of those subjects. Practice, or do you do reflective practice? And what are your challenges and what are the tensions with your experience? So that we were able, and actually what was quite nice was getting some quotes from real students and feeding them into the script.
We got involved on all the 3 topics: online learning, online team working, and reflective practice as well. So they're involved right at the beginning as well as doing the process.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
Presentation there and Cristina. So I'll just try and get the
Thank you.
Warm welcome, colleagues. Today we are moving beyond the hype, but the fact that we have moved beyond the hype regarding AI's use is demonstrated by the very fact that we are here and at this top-notch workshop. And 2 of the 6 tracks is about the use of AI in higher education. Our presentation looks into inclusion and equity and the prioritization of AI equity and inclusion in higher education, especially in a business school context. I'm Zsófia Tóth, feel free to call me Zsófia, Zsófia, anything except for Zsófia, please. I'm an associate professor in marketing and management at Durham University. I teach at undergraduate, master's, MBA, executive levels, and my research looks into innovation and also tensions. AI comes in there, and also in teaching and learning. And my partner in crime is Cristina. A few words about yourself.
I'm going to just hide behind the screen. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cristina Galalae. I'm a senior lecturer in marketing at the Open University. Now, the Open University specializes in online education, but that is not the reason why I'm interested in AI. In fact, I'm not that interested in AI, but I'm very interested in inclusion though. So all my research is based on trying to understand how societies can become more inclusive with a focus on the role of marketing. When I say that, I'm not thinking about marketing in terms of what we see in advertising as in representation, but going beyond representation. Our markets, our societies, our business, our schools, be more inclusive to people that come from different walks of life, different cultures, etc. So my interest in inclusion met the great interest of my friend Zsófia in AI. And this is the story of the beginning of this project. And in fact, this project is at the beginning, right? We are trying to share some incipient work in progress thoughts here with you and really appreciate your insights and feedback.
Mainly the theoretical framework, but we already started social listening and some of the data collection, but we are at that point where we can put emphasis on different directions. So we would welcome your feedback, what resonates best with you and your teaching and learning practices.
Yeah, and just to summarize what we're going to try to walk you through today, we will try to draw a bit from literature, emerging literature in higher education. There's a build-up towards a stream of research in this area, and also literature aimed at diversity and inclusion. We are planning to develop an exploratory multi-method study, and I'll say a bit more about it later on. And we want to use the ethics of care as an enabling theory to make sense of the ethical nuances of developing AI policy. and again, going in depth later on, the view of looking into this, or the reason behind looking into this aspect is at a theoretical level to better conceptualize the role that AI can have to enhance inclusion and diversity and equity via education, but at the same time to also support the development of more inclusive guidelines that can inform the use of AI for enhanced inclusion rather than as a way to create or reproduce inequalities. Zsófia, and I'll invite my colleague Zsófia to talk a bit about the theoretical framework of our project.
Well, we started to delve into that rich and emerging literature that is relevant for the topic we are investigating, both from practice and from literature. We realize that the use of AI is really revolutionizing the ways of teaching and learning as we know now. So it is a seismic shift. A few key streams that you have seen in the literature is, for instance, a discussion on authenticity. What is authentic in the world of AI use? How we own and to what extent we know and own our written pieces, including student submissions. And looking into assessment, I'm sure that all of us have intense conversations at our universities, how we accommodate to assessment and assessment practices in reflection to what is happening in EIC. And our colleague Zsófia, who is here at King's University, but unfortunately he's away today, he wrote a lot about this, for instance, maybe incorporating smaller multiple assessments instead of one large piece, and encouraging the use of AI in different ways for assessment. But there are different opinions about this in the literature. And with the use of AI, we see the deepening of the digital divide. Digital divide is nothing new in itself, but the way AI use accelerates this is relevant for our daily practices. And also with students with special needs in mind, there are different opinions on, there are affordances, for instance, in relation to creating personalized learning plans, but also maintaining that human touch can be challenging. So there are a lot of changes in that space, and like all coins, the coins have two sides. One is affordances, the positive side, the encouraging aspects of using AI from a diversity and equity perspective. For instance, algorithm fairness. AI is less influenced by human bias if applied appropriately. Also, with AI, we can identify some performance biases, again, some assessment, and we can potentially use virtual assistants, including students for learning and teaching purposes, as a real-life support. So there are lots of positives, and these are only a few of those positives. And of course, there are some challenges as well. Some of the colleagues emphasize the importance of inequalities that we need to be mindful of, and increasing digital exclusion. And it came up in the previous discussion that yes, some students have advanced versions of AI tools. Yes, so that actually increases the exclusion of certain student groups, and we should be mindful of algorithm bias. It's still there, and thankfully colleagues are very mindful of this and review the AI outputs from a diversity viewpoint, but it's there, and if we and our students don't take these outputs with a pinch of salt, then we might end up with a more biased body of work. And there are some tensions between algorithmic aversion, that we don't want to use AI, but also we observe that some students eventually prefer checking things with AI instead of speaking of that can be intimidating in certain cases, especially when it comes to diverse groups from different international backgrounds who might feel the burden to speak up in certain cases. Right. And when connecting these teaching and learning policies to a wider policy context, we just want to highlight the UNESCO's initiative on the global acceleration of connectivity for education, including for higher education, to put the most marginalized groups into the center. And the key idea here is that instead of inclusion and equity being an afterthought, it should be a priority from the very beginning and should influence and inform the way we formulate policies, not only at macro level, but also at institutional level and in case of our teaching and learning practices.
Which brings us to our research question, right? So here's all this very complex background that we try to present in 5 minutes, and she did an amazing job doing that. We're trying to better understand what needs to be done in order to develop guidelines for the use of AI in higher education that enhance equality and inclusion, or equity and inclusion, at individual, organizational, and societal level. So we know that we can look at inclusion as a form of belonging, right? At an individual level, if people feel like they belong in a space or not, or in an environment or not. But we also can look at inclusion at the level of policies in one institution, right? And we see, for instance, Zsófia was alluding to already, more and more policies at the institutional level on how to use AI in our assessment, in our teaching, etc. But also beyond our individual universities, there's guidelines at the European level, for instance, in the EU, etc. So we see these levels of guidelines. But it's also relevant to think about how our practices contribute to societal inclusion, right, at the higher level. How what we do in our institutions come together to create a less inclusive and equal society. So we're trying to look at these questions from the perspective of guidelines, frameworks that can guide policy. And what we envision at this point is a multi-method study. We want to start, we are thinking, we are open feedback, but we are thinking about starting with a critical review of the existing guidelines, right, and policies in universities in the UK, better understand what is already out there. But also, when we are looking at this project, we want to look at different stakeholders. So when we're going to review these guidelines, we want to see what they suggest in terms of the use of AI for students, for educators, but also for professional services, because we don't talk enough about all these actors. Following up on that, we are thinking about looking at an ethnographic study. So ethnography is a form of social listening. I'm simplifying things because we don't have time to go into details. But what we want to do is to look at online communities and how they discuss their experiences, their interactions with AI, their understanding of policies, etc. Now, one advantage about looking at ethnography is the fact that people might share their views and opinions in a more direct way. There were questions before when Rachel was talking about their great research, about how sometimes we talk to people that are self-selected, that are already interested in topic, right? By looking at online Reddit forums, for instance, teaching communities, etc., we can understand what people are concerned about in a more naturalistic way.
And following up on that, we are also thinking about looking at some in-depth interviews where we can investigate, based on what we learned from the previous studies on secondary data, what is the experience, the subjective experience of individuals with the use of AI. Now, these kind of perspectives, these questions that we are looking at, points towards the good or the bad, or the good and the bad, in developing policies and guidelines, right? So points towards an ethical question. And importantly, it's also highlighting the importance of different stakeholders, right? We're looking at students, services, educators. So if you can move to the next slide, please, thank you so much. So this brought us to looking into the ethics of care. Now, the ethics of care is interesting because it enables us to look at relationships, right, and contextualization. Often, the guidelines that we have on the use of AI are focused on things like autonomy, integrity, like when Ian was talking about his study. In often, on two occasions, Ian mentioned, I don't see Ian here. Yeah, thank you. Ian was talking about knowing when the student is using AI or not, guiding the student using it or not, right? So this is a discourse that has to do with making sure that the assessment offers the opportunity for students to be assessed correctly in an integral way, right? That they have the autonomy, that we are assessing them for what they do. And a lot of the focus on the discourse around guidelines for the use of AI has to do with this form of ethics of justice. But the ethics of care is a bit different because it places the emphasis on people's feelings and the relationship between different actors. Again, Ian was talking earlier about how sometimes when students are told that they can use AI, they still feel the anxiety of admitting that they've done that, right? That is a focus on emotion that shows us that students, when they use it, when they have this regulation, they also care about their own emotions. So this kind of perspective on the ethics of care enables us to look at the use of guidelines in education from a more contextual, relational, embodied perspective, right? And in order to want to look at this perspective, we will use to offer some contributions. Before we go into contributions, go ahead, that I have on that slide. There are different ways of looking at care. I'm not going to go much directly. So you really show you the several perspectives that we can take into consideration. When we talk about care, we talk about care for the self, for the other, and the relationship between them. An important part that we are interested in is how the guidelines for AI look at this, multiple perspectives. When we develop guidelines on how to use AI in our teaching, we are interested in the integrity of our students, but also, when Michelle was saying before, in our own time as well, right? Maybe we want to be more efficient in terms of marketing, for instance. How do those two come together, okay? Or we can look at Toth's perspective that looks at caring about, caring for, care giving, and care receiving. So again, different levels of understanding what care means, right? As an example, what one can care about the fact that different learners have different needs, so we need to develop their understanding of how to prompt the AI, right? For instance, in order to get the result that they want to get. But these learners, based on their cultural diversity, might have different ways of prompting the machine itself. So even that creates inequalities. And this enables or brings us or moves us to caring for, right? So thinking about the responsibility that we have as educators to care about how we give that form of care, so what kind of regulations we develop, and how that care is being received. And yes, so in the end, we are hoping that by going through this analysis and through our project, we will theorize the ethical implications of using AI in education at individual, organizational, and societal level, and inform the development of more inclusive guidelines for the use of AI in education. So maybe I mentioned anything here.
No, really. I mean, I was reflecting on our discussions and that AI anxiety discussion came up here that may have an impact on equity. That we had a discussion on who uses which AI tools and how, and it almost felt like a counseling session where we feel to what extent we feel confident or familiar with certain tools. And that's very interesting because this is something that came up in the discussion that colleagues also about this with students. And when we talk about AI use between each other, it seems that there are AI use bias, whether we use or we don't use AI. So that's also part of that digital design perhaps. But yeah, let's see what colleagues.
Okay, yeah.